So friends, welcome to this 17th session of Community Month. As we gather for the final weekend of Community Month, I'd like just to mark the fact that today is Transgender Day of Remembrance. I'm really grateful to Annie Sharples for reminding me of that, so that's great. One of the sobering facts that Annie reminded me of is that this year there have been 350 reported murders worldwide of trans people and a further 59 reported suicides. I'm going to invite Alex Clare Young, a member of our community and the author of Transgender Christian Human, to lead us as we open, to lead us in prayer. Let's pray.
Let's pray. Heavenly Creator and Parent, as we commemorate the lives of non-binary and trans people lost this year, we recognize the tragedy of each death, the stripping away of dignity that leads us back to the cross. May the diverse and courageous individuals and communities that we commemorate today be remembered for their lives as well as their deaths. May those who mourn be comforted by the hope of new life, of transformation, of a better world. May we be some of those who co-create with you new life, transformation, a better world. Fill our lives, our communities, and this world with hope, peace, and love, and strengthen us as we continue our lives in the service of your values. Amen.
Thank you so much, Alex. And those themes that we prayed for, new life, transformation, and a better world, are themes that draw us together under a whole series of banners. And it is this focus that with which I'd like to welcome Rowan with us today. Rowan, it is a huge privilege and a great delight to welcome you in our midst. You're joining us this evening, I think from Cardiff, welcome. Previously Bishop of Monmouth, Archbishop of Wales, Archbishop of Canterbury, academic and author, and most recently Master of Magdalen College in Cambridge, and now I believe gloriously retired. It's a privilege to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege for me. Great delight to be with you.
Good, and we can hear you, which is great. Thank you for, thank you for zooming
Probably
in.
a help.
And we know that your internet is a little bit unstable, so if for any reason you drop out, we'll not worry that you've run away. Not yet, at least. Rowan, I've received a series of questions from our members, which you and I have looked at together. The idea is that you're going to respond to three or four of them, and then we're going to have a bit of time in small groups just to respond, to reflect together, and then come back and you'll look at the final batch of questions. So I hope that will, I'm sure the time will fly past. So I guess we really just need to get going with the first question, if that's okay. Oh, and Kathy as saying, chair of Christian Aid for the last 7 years. Absolutely.
Thank you, Kathy.
So, Rowan, you have written very movingly, and I've got the book here, and I know a number of us have been reading this. You've written about the rule of St. Benedict in the way of St. Benedict. And the first question, which is a combination from a couple of people, is about this. You speak of the monastic life as living every day standing alongside the same people in a small space, like in a marriage, perhaps, or in an intimate relationship of some kind. The rule enables a depth of relationship with people one has not chosen. Can you say more about the impact of this rule on your own life and your own relationships?
Thank you. Yes, I'll try and say a word about that. Certainly, when I first encountered the rule of St. Benedict and began talking to people who lived it out, that was what came home to me most clearly, that the sheer getting up and getting on was a large part of it. It's often said that the rule of St. Benedict is a very prosaic document. There's not much about ecstasy or mysticism. The main thing is, who does the dishes. And I think for me, that sense that there's a level of your life where you simply have to acknowledge that other people, circumstances, and so forth are not going away. That's quite a breakthrough moment. Because a lot of us live a lot of our lives with a sort of hidden assumption that if we could just tidy away certain bits of ourselves, certain bits of other people, certain bits of the world, then at long last we could be the people we were supposed to be. And the fact is we are plugged in, we are connected in the web of the world, and like it or not, there are things we cannot instantly change and things that are not going away, and how we cope with that, with grace, with patience, with courage, and with transformative hope. I think that becomes really important. So I guess that particularly when I was working as a bishop and most of all as Archbishop of Canterbury, I spotted myself quite often saying, you know, I could be a really good bishop or archbishop if only so-and-so weren't there. And as I say, it's a bit of a breakthrough when you realize that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And therefore you have to cope with what's given, not passively, not uncritically. You have to live with it. You have to make something of it.
The givenness, I suppose, is the thing. And in our community, as you know, we're a dispersed community, and this is just a continuation of this first area. So we don't, most of us, in fact, very few of us actually live in community together in the way that the monastics did and do. And yet there is something that we share that is of that nature, of that givenness. We meet in family groups, which
Yep.
are geographically located. And in a sense, there's a givenness about them, like, you know, attending the given congregation in our geographical area. What happens? How do we live in relationship with the people that we maybe don't always rub along well together beside? I don't know if you've had experiences that can help illuminate that struggle that some of us have.
Yeah. I mean, most of my own experience is simply within the family context here. But I guess that one of the things which dawns on us at some point is none of us really know what difference we're making. It's not as if we're meeting the same person every day, or that other people are meeting the same me every day. There are all sorts of subtle shifts going on if we're trying to live in some sense prayerfully and companion and respectfully. There are tiny little recalibrations of the balance, tiny little shifts in who we are and how we see things. And sometimes it will take somebody from right outside that relationship to spot it. But I think the real act of trust that's going on in any kind of shared life, whether it's an intentional community or a family or whatever, the act of trust is that those tiny little shifts of perspective and those tiny little growings and changings are worthwhile. They are the real currency of it.
And yet, there must be times when that trust does break.
Oh,
and
yes.
when the distances become too great, whether we're in community, whether that's in a relationship or living in an intentional community.
That's right. And that's why you do need shared discernment about how to live in this. The discernment that says, well, you know, actually, I've come to a point where I can't cope, and now I need to cope with my not coping. I remember when I was working at the Theological College in Mirfield back in the 1970s. Of course, the college was attached to a monastic community, and I spent most of my vacations living with the monastic community there. And of course, there were difficulties within the community, as there are in all communities. And I remember always one of the brothers saying to me at one point, one of our problems as a community is we seem to think we can cope with anybody and everybody. And that means there are a lot of people around whose behavior doesn't get challenged, and yet we're not good at coping with the fallout. And we're somehow not grasping a nettle there, not able to say, you know, actually, we can't quite do this. And that stuck with me. It's a painfully honest perception, but that's where you do need honest shared discernment. is the change happening, or is a pattern of codependence or mutual erosion and undermining going on? We need a larger framework. We need the whole life of the community to help us discern there, I think.
And I suppose as members, we have an annual process called the With Us process when we opt back in again. And I suppose part of that opting in is a reaffirmation that now, regardless of how tough it's going to get, we're sticking with it, because there are moments of delight and beauty and insight and shared discernment, which take us closer to God, take us closer to whatever we
That's right.
think of as the divine.
I was thinking also of a correspondence I had a few years ago with a woman called Iona Community, whose name may be familiar to some of you, great campaigner for women's ordination in the Church of England and the Church in Wales. And I had the great privilege of ordaining her as a priest when I was Bishop of Monmouth. But Iona, in her last years, developed the idea that we should put ourselves in the way of getting what she called a gospel audit from time to time. We should find a couple of trusted friends to help us look at various knots and tangles in our lives in the last 2 or 3 years and do what she called a gospel audit. How far have these problems pushed me to understand the gospel more deeply? Where have the pinch points been? Where have I stepped forward? Where have I stepped back? And I remember quite an intense correspondence with her about how to shape this. And I guess something of that sort goes on in every community life, explicitly or not, but probably the more explicitly the better.
Yeah, it's like a kind of dance, a holy dance, if you like, about how do we shape the moves, then we might not always know what they look like.
That's right.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the second question, if that's okay. And I think they all connect. And these first three are all a little bit to do with the rule of Benedict and how that's influenced your life and what that might have to say to our life in community. So this is, again, a hybrid from a couple of members, but I'll read it. And I know you've got these in front of you too. Benedictine monasteries have a story. This is not just the story of their order, but a story that is rooted within their monastic buildings and traditions. When monks or nuns get up in the morning, they get up to live the rule, to join in with the story, which takes and guides and nurtures and draws them ever closer to Christ, their King. We are a scattered community held together by our rule and by our shared story. So here's the question. What wisdom may we glean from the Benedictine story in order to recreate our story, one that holds and connects us, so that we too emerge every day, however scattered, to live the rule? And I guess it's a development of that earlier, the question of the dance, I suppose.
Yeah. No, that's a really, really good question, I think. And I think I'd want to give two answers to it. First of all, there's, of course, what you actually say together about yourselves when you get up in the morning. It's not just doing things, it's also in a typical religious community, residential religious community. You get up and you say the Psalms together. You make that language of a covenanted people your own. You say, I'm part of a story in which God has promised to be present. When I look at my past and the past of this group that I'm with, what I've got to look for and listen for is that story of a God who's promised to be there. And not everybody, of course, recites the Psalms morning and evening. Not everybody plugs into that particular kind of tradition of, for me, as an Anglican priest, the daily office. But what we say together in that sense becomes the shared story. We identify ourselves. We put ourselves somewhere and say, well, that's where I belong.
Okay.
Second aspect of that, I suppose, is that the rule of St. Benedict sets out a kind of trajectory for growth. The long chapter on the degrees of humility, things like that in the rule, where you're simply asked to look at your own memory, your own practice, and say, well, again, what's changing, what's moving, what's going forward, what's going backwards. Because there is a story there. The story is letting go of my secure and self-serving habits, finding my place in a community where everybody has an utter claim on my respect and my nourishing service. That's the story. I'm growing into that.
Mm.
And how do I make that something that I'm aware of? Not in a sort of self-conscious, fussy, always checking way, but stand back and ask, are those the priorities that are actually working? Where have they slipped? Where have they fallen off?
Mm. And of course, as you'll know, in our daily office, we still sometimes call it that, we recite the Psalms, and in the Abbey on Iona, there's a rhythm of reciting the Psalms in the mornings, and that's actually been continued. One of our members, Andrew Simon, has been with others making sure that that's accessible online. So yeah, joining in with the big story, the story of in Scripture and the story in creation, if you like. And interestingly, our rule of life was adapted. It evolves, and a number of years ago, we had adapted the first of our rules to include we commit ourselves to daily prayer, worship with others, and regular engagement with the Bible and other material which nourishes us. Because of course we recognize that in other profound, wise material, there is an invitation to join in with that story. So yeah, I guess there's something of the expansive nature of that story writ large in a number of traditions, and we're opting into the Christian tradition most deliberately.
Exactly, and I think also of the phrase which comes up in the rule at the end of the Degrees of Humility, never to despair of the mercy of God. Now, not despairing of God's mercy is always to have the story to hand of a God whose restoring generosity never fails. And that's the subtext of whatever we read in Psalms and Scripture. Okay. This is a God whose generosity does not fail. So we can't despair of that.
And for so many of us who've come to an organization or a community like the Iona Community, we've met despair in a variety of contexts, not least within the church, and have often felt despairing of that body that represents Christ on earth, if you like. And yet, so we'll come to a question about that relationship later on, but I guess just noticing that the journey can be really tough for many of us, whether we're inside or outside the church. And I think given the Transgender Day of Remembrance today, for so many people, they've been actively excluded and still are. So there's cause for despair, but what you're saying is obviously noticing in the story the cause for hope that is in the mercy of God.
Because it's not just about my resources or my success or the church's resources and the church's success. It's about that living word of promise, however understood, however heard. The living word of promise, which for us as Christians is literally embodied in Christ crucified and raised from the dead. And that is so much more than what I as an individual can come up with, or even we as an individual can come up with. It just sits there.
Sure. Thank you. The third area, before we're going to pause at around about past. So we've got another 10 minutes or so to explore this, however long we need. Is a different slant, really, if you like, on the rule. In your book, there's a chapter on Benedict in Europe. And I guess as I was reading the way of St. Benedict, I was reflecting on how the rule of Benedict has something, and you said this, has something very profound to say to us now about unity and about global identity, particularly in Europe. The Iona community from the beginning, and particularly since the 1990s, has a very strong global reach. And we've seen that writ large in these last 8 months in a very profound way, as we have been scattered in a way that none of us would have wanted and stopped from meeting together. So we have actually also discovered a new way of connecting across the globe. We have members and associate members who live in the continent of Europe. Many of them are here in the USA, in Canada, in Malawi, in Kenya, in New Zealand, and in Australia. That's just a few. Our membership also now, not in the beginning, but now is made up of members of all the main Christian denominations. And many who are, like I was mentioning, kind of on the edge of anything to do with institutional church. Some actually actively not involved in mainstream Christian traditions. So we value our unity in diversity, and we seek to model and to bear witness to this call to be one wherever we are. In January 2021, we see the UK formalise its political separation from the European Union. As an intentionally global ecumenical community committed to celebrating unity in diversity and committed to a radical, costly, even prodigal hospitality, to borrow the words of Craig Gardner from our last Bible study, a prodigal hospitality which demands that we welcome the other or the stranger. And here's the question: what hope is there for the world within our current political climate? And what can we as people of faith bring to this seemingly disintegrating, fracturing society where the rifts between sectors seem to be getting bigger? The rich and the poor, for example, one major example.
Yes, it makes me think of the back page of the New Statesman every week has a sort of Q&A with some celebrated figure or other, and the last question is always, are we all doomed? And some people do say yes and some people say no, but it's fascinating to see who says what and why. And I sometimes think, well, what would I say to that question? And a lot depends, of course, on how I'm feeling day by day. But I think I'd probably go back, first of all, to never to despair of the mercy of God, and then say, so what stories are we actively telling, and to whom are we telling them, of the ways we overcome those currents of isolation and suspicion? What stories can we tell? To whom are we telling them? And there's such a wealth of stories around, and I don't mean that in a kind of Pollyanna, everything's fine sense, but there are real flesh and blood stories. I'm thinking of the Jewish family I knew in Cambridge, who took in a Syrian refugee to live with them a couple of years ago, and the conversations I've had with all of them, particularly with the Syrian refugee in question, trying to teach his style of cookery to the Jewish family he was living with, that kind of thing. Now, we can multiply those stories. We know that the barriers we erect break and crumble in some quite surprising places with some quite surprising people. And that's worth knowing, because when we know that barriers can crumble, we know that they're not fixed forever. They're not set in concrete. We set them in concrete the more we imagine that they can't crumble. See what I mean?
Yeah.
A lot of the work has to be done in our imagination. So I would say that's part of the story question.
Sure. And I guess in your role as chair of Christian Aid, looking to the global south and watching democracy in the global north, really not making a great fist of itself, and
Okay.
actually leading us to a situation. You talked about despair of real fear and terror for many, that that an election can be questioned so dramatically and so consistently in the face of all facts in front of us. How do we share this story across the globe in a world that seems to be fracturing? Where is the hope? I mean, there are obvious answers to that in terms of, our community. We're connecting more fully, but the disparities are evident in our own community as well. We are largely from one kind of ethnic origin, I guess, with one there's a real homogeneity within our community. The diversity is not fantastic, yet it's a goal that we have. So how do we embrace greater diversity? Yeah, and I love the notion of asking the question, with whom are we sharing our stories? And what stories are we sharing of the overcoming? And in this audience, in this group, there are fantastic examples of people like your friends who have thrown wide open their doors and welcomed in the stranger, the refugee, the friend. But yeah, it feels like a crucial time, a kairos moment in the world, in the story of the world, where we need to take this to a new level, this hospitality.
That's right. And you know, I wish I had a simple answer to how we get the message out. But witness within neighborhoods, creating events within neighborhoods where stories can be shared, using where we can the networks of local churches, local political parties, and of course the ever-present social media. And I think one of the things that I'd want to put in there as well, and that's why I mentioned my Cambridge friends as I did, is the issue of what do we learn from hospitality? Not what do we give simply, but what do we learn? And I go back to St. Benedict, and I'm always struck by the fact that in that very, very hierarchical society, 1500 years ago, Benedict is able to say, well, you know, the youngest person in the community will have something to say. Listen. And they may know more than you do. They may have the sort of deal-breaking insight that will take you forward. Now, I like to project that, if you like, onto the global stage and say, well, how do we then foreground in our common life and our language what we're learning? It can be as domestic and basic as my friends learning something about Syrian cuisine, their guest. It can be something much more, I don't know, much more demanding in what we might learn about community life and community support from, I suppose, some of the communities I've seen at work in parts of the developing world through Christian aid and in other ways. I think I can say, well, I wish we could learn how to learn as they learn and share their learning in community. But it's difficult. I don't make light of the fact that it's really difficult to get the message out there in a noisy, crowded, short attention span environment where a great deal of what we think we know and we think we're sure of is actually decided for us by a small group of very, very wealthy and very self-interested people.
Sure. And you know, I think I'd like to give the Iona community some credit for taking that message out there, along with others like Christian Aid, you know, and some of the member stories that we hear shared through some of through ecumenical of the sacrificial hospitality. That I love the way that Craig talked about reckless hospitality, the sense of caring less about the impact on us, obviously, and more about the mutuality. Rowan, we're at the end of the first cluster of questions. It is 7:30. We're going to take a pause at this stage and have, I think, about 20 minutes in small groups for people to, and groups of about 4 screens, I think, what we're going to do, so that people can have a chance just to check in. Well, having heard your responses to these initial questions, what further thoughts might they have? Do you have a question for us, or even an inkling of some thoughts that you might want to put to the community? And there's no pressure if you don't want to, that's fine. But
well, given the questions and given what we've been talking about, I wonder whether people might share a bit about this question of how they expect themselves and others to grow and how they spot and think about change within relationships.
Okay, so how do you expect each other to grow And I missed the last one, to spot.
How do you actually spot the change? How do you
Okay.
measure it? Can people think of breakthrough moments where they've said, actually this is changing, it didn't feel like it, but it is changing?
Okay. So I'll make a note of that and we can put it into the chat. So the invitation is, if you would like to, share something of how do you expect each other within this community to grow and to grow and change, and how do you spot or measure the change or the breakthrough moments in your spiritual journey, in your life and community, or your life in this community, something of that nature. But yeah, the next questions that are coming, just to give you a heads up, everybody, we have a question from the Israel-Palestine Common Concern Network and one from the LGBTQ+ area of concern that we have. And then we have a question about, two questions really to finish with, about the relationship between a community like ours and the church as institution, and how we can deepen and broaden and strengthen and challenge, mutual challenge, I suppose, in that relationship, so that we can all become closer to this story. So those are thank you so much for this first series of reflections. Thank you for your question to us, and we'll send you off into groups now, and we'll come back at about 10 to 8 for the next bit. And Rowan, you're going to stay in this small room with myself and a couple of others for now. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, friends, so usual practice, you should find a breakout room on your screen. Press the
Welcome back, folks. Nice to see you. Hope that was a useful time together. As you're coming in, I want just to invite you. So we've got another 3 questions that I'll put to Rowan on your behalf. If in the course of your conversation, you have thoughts, questions, comments that you'd like to make to Rowan, please put them in the chat, and Isabel and Fidge will scan them, and we've got time at the end, and we'll take some questions and comments at the end, and maybe invite you, if there's time, to ask them yourselves. So I think we're all back, which is good. Do we have Rowan back? Hooray. Welcome back. I love the way Zoom works. So thank you so much. If you missed that, if you were just coming back in again, just to say that there will be some time towards the end when your comments and questions can be put to Rowan. So if you have any, please put them in the chat, and that way we can cluster them a little bit and see what threads there are. Yeah. But for now, let's carry on with a question that came from the Israel-Palestine Common Concern Network. Let me just get it on my screen. So you'll know, Rowan, that we've got 7 common concern networks. They're these thematic groups under which we cluster and meet, and they intersect and they overlap, as you could imagine. But they're really getting going and making the most of digital technology. So this is what the Common Concern Network had to say. The Iona Community has 7 common concern networks. I've already said that. Here's a specific question from our CCN on Israel-Palestine. So the Iona Community has a long interest in issues of justice and peace, and was involved in formulating the British response to Kairos Palestine. Many of our members have worked in Israel-Palestine. We note that many politicians and church leaders, whilst privately supportive of the Palestinian cause, are very reluctant to speak out publicly in support of Palestinian rights. As someone with a long-standing commitment to both justice and to working for unity within the church and with other faiths, how can Christians respond to Cry for Hope, recent report, and to the open letter from Christian clergy in the Bethlehem area? And how can we raise questions of justice for the Palestinians when criticism of the Israeli government is all too often anti-Semitism, And I just want to reassure my co-members of this community that Rowan did have that question in advance. He's not hearing it just for the first time. It's a long one and a complex one. And we're not expecting you to bring world peace tonight, but it would be handy.
Yeah, well, don't be too disappointed if I don't. But no, it's a huge question. And thinking back over the last few years, I've at various points been accused of being in the pay of the Israeli government and also being a supporter of Hamas and unrestricted terrorism. So I've had both ears chewed off on this one, as I guess other people in this group have also. So a couple of things. One is that, of course, we are, in some important sense, as European Christians, we are tainted with a long, long, bitter history of anti-Semitism. And we have got to be upfront about that. And we have got to say that is an unforgivable legacy, and we are still living with it. And, you know, the fact that it's still a current issue in our own country, that it's still a current issue in the United States, we'd better not forget that. And very often when people complain that the criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic, I share the exasperation many people feel about that when that point is made. And also a part of me says, yeah, but exactly what have I done and am I doing to make sure that my Jewish brothers and sisters are secure where they are? So I just, you know, need to put that into the mix there. But that being said, there is obviously a major issue of standing alongside our Christian and Muslim brothers and sisters in the Palestinian community on the grounds of basic natural justice and the need for self-determination. One of the things that complicates it is, of course, that the dysfunctional history of political action in the region for the last few decades hasn't given us any very clear, very credible goal to work for beyond the two-state solution, which is becoming more and more unimaginable every day. That's the kind of despair that can overtake us in that context. And so certainly without any peace plan or roadmap or whatever, my own personal response is increasingly to try and give as much energy as I can to supporting those groups that try to go on building bridges. The Bereaved Families Forum, the One Voice Network, groups like that, which at great cost are trying to say in the Israel-Palestine setting, we have somehow got to imagine a future that includes both of us. It's another version of what we were talking about earlier. The others are not going away. They really aren't. And the frightening thing about the extremes on both sides is, let's be honest, there are sectors of the Palestinian population for whom the disappearance of the state of Israel will be a mercy. There are people in Israel for whom the expulsion of all Palestinians would be a mercy. That can't be it. So I want to find out where there are people trying to conceive a future together. And I mentioned the Bereaved Families Forum because I've been involved in conversation with them over many years, and a few years back organized a sort of conference for them and a number of other cross-frontier groups in the region to see if they could share experience a bit in this very difficult task of witnessing to a possible shared future. And all of them were feeling very, very beleaguered, very exposed, very isolated. All of them from both sides were feeling the cost of going against the grain of their own communities by making these contacts. And that's why I felt personally that I could best put my energies to work in supporting them and trying to help tell their story.
And I suppose that's another example of the kind of prodigal or radical hospitality at an extreme level, that that is being displayed by the groups, the bridge building groups that you've mentioned.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
And
My first
sorry, go on.
My first contact with the Bereaved Families Forum was literally with somebody whose son had been killed by a Palestinian activist, and somebody else whose brother had been killed by an Israeli sniper.
Yeah.
And they were sitting together on my sofa, talking about the abuse that they had from their own communities when they tried to introduce one another to tell the other side's story. And I thought, yeah, that is such a cost. That is radical hospitality indeed, reckless hospitality.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The cost of the rejection from within your own community.
Yes,
Should
yes.
you choose to engage with the other. I mean, it's a level of hospitality that I find in my own life experience unimaginable. I have to listen to the others who have had these experiences. But thank you for that. I know that there are a number of questions coming in, so I am going to crack on through our questions that are here already, and then see if we can have time to turn to the ones that have been coming in. This next one is a kind of, it's related in that it's from another common concern network. So our newest common concern network focuses on augmenting the voice of the LGBTQ+ community. The churches have not been at their best in the welcome they offer to those who identify as LGBTQ+. How can we reverse this hostile hospitality in our religious communities and in the church?
Well, as you said, these are the large questions, aren't they? And I would say, looking back, that most of my 10 years as Archbishop of Canterbury was really heavily shaped by trying to manage that particular question. And if I'm honest, not doing a very good job of it, because the extremes were getting more polarized at that time. Resistance to the inclusion of LGBTQ+ people in some quarters of the Anglican Communion was becoming much more marked. And even in the Church of England, of course, as you know, we had really difficult discussions about the protocols and boundaries and all the rest of it. So most of my experience of this has been, if I'm honest, the experience of my own failure in handling it effectively, which makes it quite a raw subject in some ways. That being said, one or two observations. One is that increasingly, what I wanted to do was to try and get people together in affirming the sheer human dignity, never mind the theology for the moment of sexual activity, but let's start with the human dignity of people involved. Let's start with the right to make decisions about your life, the expectation that you will be legally protected and honored, the expectation that your decisions will be respected. Let's start there. And to a very small extent, I think we got somewhere on that front. I remember in 2011, I think, the meeting of the Anglican archbishops, the primates across the world, did at last make a statement about the legal rights of LGBTQ+ people, which was a bit more unambiguous than before. Lots of people said too little, too late, and I fully understood that. But it didn't feel like nothing at the time. Because I think if one can just focus on that sheer element of human respect, it's a way in. And there's an analogy that crossed my mind from the time I spent many, many years ago working briefly with the church in South Africa, very much in the bad old days of apartheid. And I was talking to a very experienced South African priest about the great controversies in the churches there at the time about whether they should be supporting the ANC's direct action. Aren't we supporting violence, and shouldn't we be holding out against that? And this priest said, it's all very well for us to discuss this, but out there people are making decisions without waiting for us to tell them. So the question is, do we respect, live with, and to whatever extent we can support decisions made in conscience and prayer and good faith? And that increasingly, that sort of helped me think about our position with the LGBTQ plus parts of our community. So that's just an analogy that keeps coming back. People are not waiting for us, the institutional church, to tell them. They are making decisions. We have to assume that they're making decisions as adults. If they're Christians, we have to assume they're making decisions as Christian adults.
Yeah.
And
yet,
you know,
and yet the hurt and the pain that is inflicted, and the power, the imbalance of power,
yes,
surely there are things that we, I guess, are compelled to speak out
yes,
about in all of that.
yes.
But yes, not waiting for the church as institution to change, but we are church in the broadest sense. And so any change that we make is that. And yet we can't ignore the imbalance of power and the hurt and pain that is caused. So,
and I think that also prompts the question which I repeatedly want to raise in these circles, especially with people taking a very strong conservative line. What do you think is good news in what you're saying?
Yeah,
because assuming that people are hungry for the good news of Jesus Christ, how are people going to hear the good news of Jesus Christ in an exclusionary, demeaning approach? I noticed, by the way, in the chat that questions coming through about why the church is so preoccupied with this at the moment and with sexual ethics in general. And I wish I knew the answer, I must say, because it's not something that Jesus seems to have been particularly worried about. It sounds as though when questions were raised, he, as it were, shrugged his shoulders and said, well, you know, I understand the rule book, but just look around, don't rush to judgment, and be ready to be challenged yourself by the people you think you have a right to look down on. And that's so fundamental in the gospel. So what are we doing as a church? I guess it is a cultural thing that for many people, a certain kind of sexual ethic has become a sort of cultural marker. It's a badge of identity. This is what we think, as opposed to what society thinks. And while I certainly think the church ought to be marked off from society in many important ways, I don't quite see why this should be the most important of them, frankly.
And a related question from Tony: how do we engage honestly with people, neighbours, family, colleagues, whose views we profoundly disagree with, not just politics of left and right, though that's included, but for example, transgender, same-sex relations, Black Lives Matter? And I guess there's something in what you say about the basic humanity, recognising the basic humanity in the other. But do you want to respond to that element of this question? And then we'll maybe move on to the next ones.
I'd just go back there to that other issue about what are the stories we tell and to whom do we tell them. Because I think most people who will record the way they've changed their minds, let's say on the sexuality question, will tell it very much in terms of encountering someone's personal story, someone's personal witness, and recognizing, well, there's an integrity there that I can't deny. And if we can somehow assist and support others towards recognizing that integrity by letting their stories be, helping their stories be heard, perhaps that's part of it. But it needs a patience and a discernment that's frankly very demanding for people. And also there are a lot of understandably very impatient people around who say, well, you know, we've hung around long enough waiting for you to get your act together, and we're getting just a little bit disillusioned. And
I think that's a beautifully mild understatement for some.
Very mild statement.
But I get that, yeah.
Yeah.
So these are not neat questions, they don't have neat endings, but let me move on to the next two, which are connected, and then we'll look again at, there's a one from Kathy about how we engage with and how we support our American members in addressing what appears to be a major distortion of the Christian faith in the States. And there are a couple of other ones about having a soulmate, the government's defense budget. So we'll come to these in a moment, but yeah, tick them off.
Yep.
Here's the last two that we had in advance are about the relationship with the community and the church. So I'll try to kind of make them succinct. You know that in the Iona community, we have a core part of our charitable purpose is the renewal of worship, the renewal of the church. We're not an alternative church. There's a lot more in the background to this question. I want to just cut to the chase here. Given your experience of the way of St. Benedict and your knowledge of the Iona community, what wisdom might you offer to us in the context that that the church has often failed so many people? As we seek to follow George MacLeod's injunction to find new ways to touch the lives of all, while at the same time remaining faithful to our commitment not to become a replacement or an alternative church. And the background to this was many of us are hanging on by our fingernails, increasing dysfunctionality of much of the institution of the church, evidenced by stifling bureaucracy, increasingly complex controlling internal legal systems, and so on. How do we find new ways to touch the lives of all while remaining faithful to our commitment not to become a replacement to the church?
I think it's a question that's confronted quite a lot of religious communities through the ages, frankly. Look at the Middle Ages. You have one great reform movement, the Franciscans, who just about hang in there. You have another great reform movement, the Waldensians, who break with the Catholic Church and go off on their own. And so you sense that for both of those communities, both of them deeply committed to Christ's presence with the poor. Both of those communities have the same passion. One just about manages to stay in, one shifts out. So it's not a new tension, at least. I think that we're moving into a very different era of the church's history. I used to say sometimes as Archbishop that I felt an awful lot of our Anglican communion was still living institutionally in the 1950s. That is, in the age of big committee government, where the ideal political structure was lots and lots of committees and lots of very carefully monitored representative structures. And we're just not there any longer. And a lot of those structures are echoing in a hollow sort of way, aren't they? And it's not only an Anglican problem, I know. So what can we do at grassroots level to witness not to a new church, but to, well, really back where we started, to the fidelity of God, the faithfulness of God. I've sometimes said that my hope for the future of the church is simply that if God wants company, God gets company. That is, God calls and doesn't stop calling. And when God calls in Jesus Christ, God calls to a particular kind of solidarity, mutuality, mutual accountability, mutual nourishment, the shape of life which we call the body of Christ. So, God doesn't stop calling. And the church, which is, by definition in the very word, the body of those who are called, the ecclesia, people called out, the church will go on because of that. And if we go into a bit of a tunnel of institutions, it doesn't mean that God's call is silenced. So intentional communities, religious communities, other kinds of network are more and more, I think, going to be where the audibility and visibility of God's call comes through. and who knows what the structure and the shape will look like in a couple of decades.
Sure, and somebody has just commented, I think Heinz and Marge on Iona, good thing we got rid of a lot of our Iona community committees recently. Heinz and Marge, but yes, we've only begun to emerge from a particular dependence on a committee structure in one way, but we have a necessary structure in another. I think what you say about the Franciscans and the Waldensians rings true for me, that there are times in our lives when we step in and step out. But remembering the universal church to which we belong, the world church to which we belong, rather than the specific denomination, for me is a hearty reminder. But I still hang in by my fingernails in two denominations for me. I guess that keeps me on my toes a bit, which I quite like.
Yes.
A related and final question. In your book, The Way of St. Benedict, we've mentioned it a number of times. I hope it's got a decent plug. You write that one of the very worst things that can happen to society is to come to a point where a critical mass of the population no longer has confidence that the social environment is dependable, and so concludes that they have no stake in the matter. And then you go on to ask, just how close are we to this in Britain today? And I guess this might relate to Kathy's question. How do we support our friends in the States who are watching the distortion of the Christian church? Looking at the current challenges facing British society and US society at the end of 2020, how would you answer your own question? And what do you think should be the most urgent priorities of the church and of communities like ours in addressing this challenge?
Well, I think we are very close to that point of alienation and disaffection. I think, well, with today's news about standards in government, I feel we're drifting towards a really unaccountable governmental culture. And we're looking at people whose genuine investment in continuing public good and common good is vanishingly small. So where do we start the change? Well, it's an obvious thing to say, but possibly worth saying, that we go on working for face-to-face organs of transformation at the local level. We invest more and more thoughtfully and energetically in local democracy. We try to build up from the grassroots. And we try to educate ourselves and our neighbors in genuine democratic habits. And I think the renewal of the idea of democracy is the big challenge ahead of us. We've reduced democracy to majority voting. We need to rediscover democratic process as the kind of argument where we together, all of us together, find something we can all live with, which won't be perfect, won't be everybody's ideal, but respects a minority without just giving way, but gives space, gives voice to a minority. We find the structures that will hold us beyond the electoral cycle. We find the institutions and networks that keep that public argument and discussion going. And it's going to be very hard work, I think, in the coming generation. The question about how we support Christians in the United States, I mean, this to me is such a bizarre spectacle. And a friend of mine who had been a very prominent evangelical pastor in the States very publicly relinquished his links with some of the evangelical networks about 3 or 4 years ago, having been to a meeting, pastors, evangelical pastors, where he discovered that he was the only person in the room who did not own a gun. And he thought, really, if evangelical Christian identity is going to be hitched to that particular wagon, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And really, well, it comes down to put it very, very simply, it comes down, doesn't it, to Jesus. It comes down to the Gospels. The what would Jesus do slogan, we can smile, we can write it off, we can think very simplistic. But what can we do to share the story of Jesus, the Jesus of the Gospels? Because I don't see him in the pro-gun, pro-life, pro-God brigade in the States. And a lot of these are, I don't want to sound like President Trump here, a lot of these, they're not instinctively bad, mean, selfish people, but they are locked into a culture, Christian culture, or a sub-Christian culture, which is limiting and toxic and damaging for themselves and others. And to sound very evangelical, I want them to meet Jesus.
Well, and I guess it goes back to Tony's question and to themes that we've touched on already. You know, even those who are in this extreme of evangelical, the worst kinds of evangelical Christianity, they are also our beloved in Christ. How do we engage with, honestly, Tony's question, Tony or Liz, sorry, I don't know which one of you it was. How do we engage honestly with people whose views we profoundly disagree with? And, you know, I think we are a bit like our own Twitter sphere in this community. Sometimes we meet with people with whom we feel at ease, because we need that solidarity, and that's a precious, precious thing. And yet we have our disagreements for sure within this community, but how do we really meet the other whose profound disagreements or differences? And I guess what you're pointing to is a rediscovery of the art of public conversation. I would say that the ability to walk beside somebody and share the deepest things, which is maybe different from debate or discussion even, but it's
because I think it involves that quite difficult conversation which says to the other person, I want to understand what you really want and why you want it. Help me understand what you want and why. Because that's the point at which you begin to get beyond the slogans and the posturing just a little bit. And if you can find some points of recognition there, you know, maybe a door opens. It doesn't solve it all, but maybe you can just take the next step. Yeah.
And the art of listening in order even just to understand, not necessarily to agree with one another, but to understand. Rowan, thank you. I think we've come to the end of the formal questions, but there are a few. So Kathy's question, how do we engage with and how do we support our American members in addressing what appears to be a major distortion of the Christian faith in the USA? And how do you do that without it being cheap grace?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, the American pastor friend I mentioned a little while ago found that Bonhoeffer's discussion of cheap grace was one of the things that really got him over the hurdle, got him out of his echo chamber and into a new world, because he realized that the moralism and the self-enclosure of the world he was in were a form of cheap grace. And he wrote a book very, very challenging to his evangelical neighbors, saying he still counted himself an evangelical, but he wanted to call them, as it were, on these issues. And he wanted them to understand something about why a Christian pastor like Bonhoeffer would end up paying the price of resistance. And it's not just a sort of bland, oh, well, that's what you think, that's fine. No. You have to engage, and it can be difficult all round. It can hurt you and the other. And
it can come at the ultimate sacrifice, like for Bonhoeffer with his life.
But also, just in pursuing a conversation, there can come a point where you say, I'm sorry, I can't cope with it. I've got to step back. But you will at least have perhaps helped the other and yourself pay a little bit of the price for understanding and coming together, just a little bit.
Sure. I mean, here's a question from Dawn, which is a kind of a sidestep, but I guess it goes to the heart of all that you've been saying. How important do you think it is to have one or more soulmates to assist one to check out our spiritual journey and how we have changed. And I think that comes from your question to the group about noticing and measuring and spotting the change that we see in ourselves.
I think it's really important to have people you check out with, whether you think of a spiritual director, a soulmate, a soul friend, as somebody, again, going back to Iona Kroll's model of the gospel audit, and her idea that you just identify a couple of people with whom you would, over a longish period, share your thoughts about what you were doing.
Yeah.
Because the gift of discernment, the Holy Spirit's gift of discernment, is not just an individual thing, it is given to people together.
Collective discernment.
So yes. And I think when Jesus says, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I will be there, he doesn't just mean there'll be a sort of sentimental awareness of kind of cozy, goddish presence, but there will be the active sharpness of the Holy Spirit at work in that.
Yeah.
I see somebody was asking in the chat about the name of the book by my American pastor friend. And I have, of course, now forgotten the title of the book, but his name is Rob Schenk. Rob Schenk, S-C-H-E-N-K.
I'll just put that in the chat. Good. We can Google Rob Schenk and find that book. And the book that has been behind some of the questions was The Way of St. Benedict, if that was one that others had not have been asking about. There's one further question from Jim Robertson, and it's a very specific one and a pointed one. In this Iona Community Month, our government has just expanded its defence budget at the expense of reducing overseas aid. Do we have a common view on this? Or what would your view be on this, Rowan?
I think this, on top of the absorption of DFID into the Foreign Office early this year, is sadly a signal that our current government has a very, very low investment in international aid. And that, to me, suggests a massive misunderstanding of the kind of world we're in. As if we could deal with our security questions and our prosperity questions without any sense that global security, global prosperity was an indivisible whole. And I've just, in fact, sent a statement to the press. I'm trying to write something about this at the moment, because I think it's a real erosion of the moral credibility of this country and this government.
Sure. And what a powerful way. I mean, you began by answering questions about a very common life and the very prosaic kind of washing of dishes side by side with the stranger with whom we have this common life. And we end with the world view and with the needs of the poorest and the South world, I guess, in our hearts and in our minds. Rowan, as we wind up this session, are there any final thoughts you want to share with us or any questions you want to leave us before we say our thank yous and farewells?
I just want to say thank you very, very much indeed for the privilege of being part of this conversation. Thank you for being the community you are, which has for a long time been a beacon of hope for me. And I guess the only question or challenge I leave is how you go on declaring that hope in the most audible, visible way. Because the fact that it is possible to live in Christian community like this, not in a monastery, but in the unique, dispersed, but interlocking way that the Iona community does, if that is possible, is a great gift to the wider church. And I don't underrate that for a moment. I'm deeply thankful for it.
Well, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts and from the bottom of my heart. You're very welcome to join us. It's great that you joined us this evening. But do feel welcome if you would like to become part of the wider community. You're always welcome. I know also we have been joined this evening by some of our resident team on Iona who are actually living in community in the renewed Benedictine monastery, which is Iona Abbey. So when you're next on Iona, and I believe there's a chance you'll be there next year, we look forward to welcoming you.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
You've taken us on a real tour, not just of the way of St. Benedict, but of some of the concerns that are closest to our hearts. Thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability, for your wisdom and your insights, for your mentioning of Una Kroll and Bonhoeffer and all these others in between. And we wish you all the very best in your retirement as it unfolds in these slightly strange lockdown times. I hope. Is Cardiff now out of the worst of it? Are you still locked down?
No, we're out of it in Wales now.
Okay, well, let's hope that your retirement may help you continue to flourish on your own journey. And I think I want to leave with you the words that you gave to us. May you be forever connected in the web of the world. Go well, and thank you very much. Folks, thank you all for joining us, and we will say goodbye as we normally do by, shall we sing an Ameni? We often sing together, and then if people want to go, they can, and some of us will hang around as we must, to say final farewells. But for now, thank you so much, and let's just unmute ourselves and sing a raucous Ameni.
Amen. 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 Amen.